The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen as Dr. Ethan Blake adjusted his watch, a morning ritual he repeated almost unconsciously. Sunlight flooded the space through the open curtains, illuminating the table cluttered with breakfast remnants, half-empty cereal bowls, a forgotten schoolbook, and the inevitable chaos of a family in motion. "You're going to be late again, Ethan," Rachel, his wife, remarked with a hint of exasperation as she buttered a slice of toast. Her voice carried a blend of affection and fatigue, a result of years living with the unpredictable schedule of a surgeon. She straightened the collar of Emily's shirt, their 8-year-old daughter more focused on the cartoon playing quietly in the next room. "I just can't leave without seeing this smile," Ethan replied, crouching to tickle Emily's belly. She burst into laughter, flailing her arms to escape. "Dad, you always do that," she protested, trying to sound serious. Noah, Ethan's eldest son, came down the stairs with a backpack slung over one shoulder and headphones practically glued to his head. At 14, he displayed the typical nonchalance of a teenager, but Ethan knew the boy had a thoughtful side. He removed his headphones briefly to remind his father, "You promised to help me with my biology presentation tonight. Don't forget." "I promised, and I'll deliver," Ethan assured him with a confident smile, though Rachel raised an eyebrow skeptically while placing the kids' backpacks near the door. "Dad, I still remember the last time you said that," Noah countered, crossing his arms. "We had to wing it, remember?" Ethan sighed, nodding. Okay. This time I mean it. No improvising." After a quick and chaotic breakfast, Ethan grabbed his car keys and bid the family goodbye. He dropped Noah and Emily at school as usual, cracking jokes and trying to ease the tension he always felt before a long day at the hospital. "Good luck at work, Dad," Emily shouted as she hopped out of the car, waving energetically. "And good luck with the presentation, champ," Ethan said to Noah, who merely nodded before disappearing into the crowd of teenagers. On his way to the hospital, Ethan turned on the radio, but his mind wandered. Traffic was heavier than usual, giving him time to reflect. He loved being a surgeon but couldn't deny the toll it took. Rachel was right when she said he was present but absent. He missed simple moments, family dinners, park outings, but there was always another patient, another surgery demanding his attention. While driving, his attention was drawn to a figure collapsed on the sidewalk, partially obscured by a building shadow. It was such an unusual sight that it took a few seconds for him to register what he was seeing. He braked sharply and looked again. It was a girl, small, frail, and motionless. His heart raced. Grabbing the emergency kit from his trunk, he rushed to her side. The girl was unconscious, her face bruised and breathing shallow. Turning her over gently, he noticed deep bruises along her torso and a bleeding cut on her forehead. Ethan's professional instincts kicked in. He checked her vital signs: weak pulse, shallow breaths. He suspected rib fractures, possibly a broken collarbone, which explained her difficulty breathing. Gently palpating the affected areas, he ensured he didn't worsen her injuries. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, trying to reassure her as much as himself. He didn't know who she was or what had happened, but it was clear she needed urgent help. Ethan dialed emergency services. While waiting, he studied her face. She looked so young, so vulnerable. He tried to imagine what had happened, but no explanation seemed adequate. After a few moments, an unsettling thought took hold. The ambulance might take too long, and time was against her. Instinctively, he made a decision he knew would raise questions later. He carefully lifted her fragile body and placed her in the back seat of his car. As he sped toward the hospital, one question consumed his mind: who is she? As Ethan drove quickly with the unconscious girl in the back seat, he tried to imagine what might have happened to her. But he had no clue about the real story behind her injuries. Her name was Sophie. At just 12 years old, she had already endured more hardships than many adults could fathom. To the world, she was just another homeless child on the city streets. But Sophie carried with her fragments of a past she desperately tried to remember. 2 years earlier, Sophie had a family, or at least that was the hazy memory she clung to on her hardest days. A mother who sang lullabies and a father with kind eyes. But those faces were now blurred, lost in time and pain. Sophie wasn't sure how she had ended up on the streets. All she remembered was waking up one day in a makeshift shelter, alone. From that moment on, survival became her sole purpose. The streets were merciless, especially for someone so young. Sophie quickly learned that trusting strangers was dangerous. The few times she accepted help, she fled shortly after, wary of suspicious intentions. Her only companion was an old backpack with a few clothes and a sketchbook she treasured. Amid the chaos, her pencil and pen doodles were her refuge. Sophie developed an almost instinctive routine. During the day, she hid in alleys and abandoned buildings, venturing out only to scavenge for food in trash bins or beg for small donations. At night, she sought crowded places to sleep, where the constant flow of people gave her a false sense of security. But despite her caution, the streets were rife with danger. 2 days before Ethan found her, Sophie had been approached by a group of young people who also lived on the streets. At first, they seemed friendly, offering her a piece of stale bread and a bottle of water. However, the conversation quickly took a darker turn. "You need to share what you've got," one of them said, his eyes fixed on Sophie's backpack. "Nobody survives alone out here." Sophie knew she had nothing of value except her sketchbook, but she clutched her backpack tightly. "I don't have anything," she said, trying to stay calm. "Everyone's got something," another insisted, stepping closer. "And if you don't give it, we'll take it." She tried to run, but she tripped over a loose piece of wood on the ground. They caught up to her easily. One of them grabbed her backpack while another held her arms. Sophie fought back, but she was no match for them. When they realized she truly had nothing of value, their frustration grew. "You wasted our time," one of them shouted, shoving her against a wall. The impact was brutal. Sophie felt a sharp pain in her right side and knew something was wrong. The blow to her ribs seemed to have fractured something, and she began struggling to breathe. Before she could react, another struck her left shoulder, likely dislocating her collarbone. They left her there, crumpled and silently crying, as they walked away. With great effort, Sophie managed to crawl out of the alley, but the pain was unbearable. She couldn't decide what was worse, the ribs that seemed to pierce her chest with every move or her useless shoulder, incapable of supporting her weight. That night, she fell asleep on the sidewalk, her breathing weak and irregular, believing she might not wake up again. In the car, Ethan glanced at the rearview mirror, trying to assess the severity of the situation. He didn't know what had happened to the girl, but the evidence was clear. The bruises across her torso and the limited movement in her arm pointed to serious fractures, likely to her ribs and collarbone. In addition, the cut on her forehead showed signs of early infection, meaning she had been injured longer than he would have liked to admit. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured as he sped up. "You're going to get through this." But Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy. The streets could be cruel, but he was determined to give Sophie something she hadn't had in the past 2 years, someone to fight for her. Ethan rushed through the emergency room doors carrying Sophie in his arms. The weight of her frail body felt heavier than it actually was, burdened by an urgency that extended beyond the physical. He shouted for help, his voice echoing down the corridor, and the emergency team quickly came to his aid. "She's in critical condition," he explained as he carefully placed her on a stretcher. "Probable rib and clavicle fractures, respiratory difficulties, possible hemothorax. Multiple contusions. Let's stabilize her now." The medical team sprang into action, wheeling Sophie into the trauma room. The bright lights reflected off the walls as nurses and doctors hurried around her, fitting her with an oxygen mask, monitoring her vitals, and administering intravenous fluids. As the team prepared Sophie for preliminary scans, the hospital's director, Dr. Stephen Wexler, strode into the room with his characteristic authoritative demeanor. He was known for his rigid adherence to hospital policies. "Ethan," he began, crossing his arms. "What exactly is going on here?" "I brought in a patient in critical condition," Ethan replied, not taking his eyes off Sophie. "There wasn't time to wait for an ambulance. She would have died." Wexler frowned. You know we can't admit patients without proper procedures. It's against hospital policy. Ethan turned to face the director, his gaze unwavering. She's a child, Stephen. If I hadn't acted, she'd be dead right now. Are you really going to argue about policies while her life hangs in the balance? A heavy silence filled the room. Finally, Wexler sighed, though his expression remained stern. Fine, but you're taking full responsibility for this. Any complications, any consequences, fall on you. I accept, Ethan replied without hesitation, turning his attention back to the patient. The initial scans confirmed Ethan's suspicions. Sophie had multiple rib fractures, some of which had punctured the lining of her lungs, causing a hemothorax, a condition where blood accumulates in the chest cavity. Additionally, her clavicle was dislocated, and the bruises indicated severe trauma to her liver. We need to perform a chest drain immediately, Ethan instructed the team. Once that's done, stabilize her vitals and prepare for surgery. What about the rib fractures? Asked one of the nurses. We're limited on resources for pediatric trauma cases. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. The hospital lacked a dedicated pediatric trauma unit, meaning they would have to improvise with what they had. We'll do the best we can. But first, we have to ensure she can breathe. After the chest drain and temporary stabilization, Sophie was transferred to the operating room. Ethan led the surgical team, but the tension in the room was palpable. The operation would require precision and quick decision-making, and time was critical. Her blood pressure's dropping, the anesthesiologist reported. We need to stabilize her before proceeding. Ethan adjusted the instructions, his mind racing through calculations and options. He knew that with every passing second, Sophie's chances of deteriorating increased. The team worked in sync, but the atmosphere was thick with anxiety. Finally, after hours of painstaking effort, they managed to control the hemothorax and stabilize Sophie's lungs. The bleeding from her liver was contained, and the most critical fractures were temporarily immobilized. She's stable, Ethan announced, his voice weary but resolute. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. But this is just the beginning. We'll need to monitor her closely. After the surgery, Ethan stepped into the waiting area, where a nurse approached him. Dr. Blake, she's remarkably strong. Few children would survive something like this. He nodded, feeling a mix of relief and concern. There was still so much to be done, but it was a small victory. Sophie was alive, and that was what mattered at that moment. In the small pediatric ICU room, the rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the air, a constant reminder of Sophie's fragile state. Ethan watched the numbers on the screen closely, analyzing every change as the medical staff moved around him. The weight of each passing second pressed heavily on his chest, knowing time was running out. Her blood tests show a critical drop in hemoglobin, one of the nurses reported, handing Ethan a chart. She needs an urgent blood transfusion, or she won't make it. Ethan reviewed the results, his sharp eyes taking in the gravity of the situation. Have you checked the blood bank? Yes, doctor, another physician replied. But her blood type is Rh null. We don't have anything in stock. We've contacted regional and even national banks, but there are no donors available at the moment. Rh null. The solemn expressions on his colleagues' faces reflected the severity of the situation. It was one of the rarest blood types in the world, so rare that only a handful of people globally could donate. Ethan clenched the report in his hands, his mind racing for a solution. What about her family? Do we have any identification or clues about who she is? He asked. Unfortunately, nothing yet. We're waiting for updates from the local authorities, the nurse replied. Ethan ran a hand down his face, exhaustion settling in. Keep monitoring her vitals. I'll figure something out. He left the room, the constant sound of the monitors still echoing in his ears. He pulled out his phone and made a call he knew he had to make. Rachel answered almost immediately. Ethan? How is she? Rachel's voice was laced with concern. She's stable for now, but we have a problem. She needs a blood transfusion, and her type is Rh-null. There aren't any donors available. There was a pause on the other end. When Rachel finally spoke, her voice was steadier than he expected. "Ethan, you know my blood type is Rh-null, don't you?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He could hardly believe what he had just heard. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," Rachel confirmed. "I remember when they tested me before Noah was born. It's rare, I know, but if I can help, there's no question about it." Ethan exhaled deeply, a wave of relief washing over him. "Rachel, you understand what this means, right? You'll have to come to the hospital immediately. We'll need you here." "I'm on my way," she said without hesitation. "Don't worry. Let's do this." Rachel arrived at the hospital about 30 minutes later, carrying a calm yet determined presence. She found Ethan in the ICU hallway, and he guided her to the triage room. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, holding her hands. "Even though it's safe, there are still risks, and you need to take care of yourself." Rachel squeezed his hands, her gaze firm. "Ethan, that girl has no one. If I can help her, there's nothing to think about. Let's do this." He nodded, knowing there was no dissuading her. The medical team began the process of collecting her blood, working swiftly to ensure everything was done safely. Ethan supervised every step, while Rachel remained calm, even as fatigue started to set in. When the collection was complete, Rachel was taken to a nearby recovery room, but she insisted on seeing Sophie before resting. She stood by the window, watching as Ethan administered the blood, the tension visible in his movements. "Blood pressure rising," one of the nurses reported. "Heart rate stabilizing." Ethan checked the monitors again, feeling a glimmer of hope for the first time since it all began. He glanced at Rachel through the window, seeing her smile faintly, as if she too could sense the positive impact of her donation. After hours of intense work, Sophie was finally out of immediate danger. Ethan walked to the recovery room, where he found Rachel sipping water slowly. She looked exhausted but content. "You saved her life," Ethan said as he sat beside her. Rachel looked at him and smiled. "No, Ethan. We saved her life. That girl needed us. That's what matters." He held her hand, feeling the weight of the past days begin to lift. Despite everything, the moment reinforced something he often forgot: they were a team, at home and at work. Rachel wasn't just his wife, she was his partner in every sense. As night fell over the hospital, Sophie remained stable, breathing on her own for the first time in days. Ethan knew there was still much to be done, but for now, he allowed himself to feel a little more at ease. The silence at home felt almost strange to Ethan, who was used to the constant hum of machines and hurried footsteps at the hospital. The smell of freshly baked lasagna filled the dining room as Rachel placed plates on the table. Noah and Emily sat, chatting about something trivial, but Ethan could barely focus. His mind was still at the hospital, replaying the tense moments of the day. "Dad, you seem more tired than usual," Emily observed with the unfiltered honesty of an 8-year-old. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he replied with a smile, trying to mask the exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. "It was just a long day, that's all." Rachel set a plate in front of him and touched his shoulder. "You need a break, Ethan. Not just to rest, but to really disconnect for a while." He looked at her, acknowledging the truth in her words, but before he could respond, Noah turned on the TV in the adjacent living room. The evening news filled the space with the voices of anchors reporting on the day's events. "Not while I have cases like today's," Ethan finally replied, cutting into his lasagna. "A girl needed us. He stopped mid-sentence, distracted by the anchor's voice on the television. "Breaking news," the anchor announced. "The young girl found unconscious on the city streets has been identified as Sophie Belmont, daughter of business magnate Richard Belmont. Sophie disappeared 2 years ago, when she was just 10 years old. Her disappearance was widely publicized at the time, but no leads had surfaced until now." Ethan froze. The words echoed in his mind as he slowly turned to look at the screen. An image of Sophie appeared, showing photos of her as a younger girl alongside her parents. The report continued, but he could hardly hear it. Rachel sat down beside him, equally stunned. "That's the girl you saved today?" Ethan nodded, unable to form a response immediately. He remembered finding her on the sidewalk, her life hanging by a thread. And now, learning she was someone's child, not just anyone's, but a highly publicized missing person, gave the day's events a whole new meaning. She was brought to the hospital by a good Samaritan, the anchor continued. Thanks to swift medical intervention, Sophie is now stable and recovering. Mr. Belmont has been notified and is en route to the city to reunite with his daughter. Emily, who had been quietly listening, turned to Ethan with wide eyes. "Dad, are you the Good Samaritan?" Ethan finally found his voice. "I guess I am." Noah smirked. "Looks like you were a real hero today, Dad." Rachel squeezed his hand, pride evident in her eyes. "You always are." But Ethan couldn't feel proud. His thoughts lingered on what Sophie had endured over the past 2 years. She had been alone, lost, and surviving on the streets. Now, her life was about to change again, this time, for the better. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Rachel. "Tomorrow," he said, "I need to be at the hospital when they arrive. Sophie's going to need someone to help her through all of this." Rachel nodded, understanding what he didn't say aloud. Ethan felt a deeper responsibility to the girl whose life he had saved. That night, while Rachel and the kids slept, Ethan stayed up in the living room, gazing at the city lights through the window. He reflected on the day's events, feeling a mixture of relief and responsibility. He had saved Sophie, but now he realized his life was inextricably linked to hers. And tomorrow, he would face the next chapter of her story. Ethan arrived at the hospital early the next morning. The air was crisp, and a subtle tension tightened his chest as he walked through the quiet hallways. He was certain he would be summoned to the director's office, Dr. Stephen Wexler, and he anticipated a reprimand for bypassing hospital protocols. Despite this, he felt no regret for his actions. Shortly after donning his white coat, a nurse approached him. "Dr. Blake, the director has requested to see you in his office immediately." Ethan sighed and nodded. "Thank you. I'm on my way." As he walked down the corridors, he mentally rehearsed how he would defend his decisions. But as he opened the office door, he froze. Sitting inside were Sophie, now awake, and a commanding man Ethan instantly recognized from the news, Richard Belmont. Sophie's father stood as soon as Ethan entered, his eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and emotion. Sophie, still frail, offered a small but meaningful smile. "Dr. Blake," Richard began, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Belmont. There are no words to express how grateful I am for what you've done for my daughter." Ethan shook his hand, surprised by the strength in the gesture. "Mr. Belmont, I was just doing my job. Your daughter is a fighter." Richard shook his head, his voice heavy with emotion. "No, doctor. You did far more than your job. You saved her life. I don't know how to thank you." Sophie looked at Ethan, her wide eyes still marked by the ordeal she'd endured. "You were there, when I thought I was going to die. You helped me," she said softly but firmly. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He knelt beside her, meeting her gaze. "You're the real hero here, Sophie. You kept fighting, even when things seemed hopeless." The room fell silent, the air thick with emotion. Dr. Wexler, who had been sitting quietly in his usual corner, cleared his throat before speaking. "Dr. Blake, while your actions clearly violated hospital protocol, the results speak for themselves. We're all impressed by what you and your team accomplished." Richard Belmont turned to Wexler, his tone firm. "Protocol or not, this man saved my daughter's life. If you have any issues with that, I can assure you I won't hesitate to find another hospital to support, financially or otherwise." Ethan couldn't help but feel a touch of satisfaction as he watched Wexler squirm. The director, visibly uncomfortable, simply nodded. "Of course, Mr. Belmont. There's no issue here." Turning his attention back to Ethan, Richard continued, ignoring the director entirely. "Doctor, I want to offer you something. I know you'll likely say you don't need it, but let me help in some way." Ethan shook his head. "Mr. Belmont, I didn't do this expecting anything in return. I appreciate your generosity, but saving Sophie was enough." Richard frowned for a moment before his expression softened. "Then let me help you help others. I know this hospital faces challenges. I'd like to fund the creation of a specialized pediatric trauma unit. What do you think?" Ethan was momentarily speechless. He thought of Sophie, the difficulties they'd faced treating her with limited resources. He thought of the other children who could benefit from such a unit. "If it means we can save more kids like Sophie," he finally said, "then yes. That's an extraordinary idea." Sophie reached out and held Ethan's hand, her small gesture filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said again, and Ethan knew this moment would stay with him forever. The weeks following Sophie's recovery were a whirlwind of transformation for the hospital. The announcement of the new pediatric trauma unit, funded by Richard Belmont, ignited a sense of purpose and excitement among the staff. Nurses and doctors discussed possibilities, imagining how the unit could revolutionize care for critically injured children. For Ethan, the impact went even deeper. The experience with Sophie became a turning point, not just in his career but in his personal life. At home, the changes were equally profound. Ethan began to prioritize time with Rachel and the children in ways he hadn't before. Small moments, like listening intently to Emily's stories or dedicating a full evening to helping Noah with a school project, became his new norm. Rachel noticed the shift, and for the first time in years, their family felt more connected. At the hospital, construction on the trauma unit moved quickly. Richard Belmont invited Ethan to be involved in the planning stages, solidifying a bond between the two men. Richard, a businessman accustomed to controlling outcomes, found himself vulnerable in the aftermath of Sophie's disappearance and recovery. He frequently sought Ethan's advice on how to support Sophie's emotional healing. "She talks about you a lot," Richard said during one of their meetings. "I think, in a way, you've become a role model for her." Ethan smiled but responded with quiet sincerity. "Sophie is the strong one. She survived things no one should ever have to face. I just gave her a chance to fight back." Richard nodded, visibly moved. "Even so, thank you. For her and for what you're building here." One afternoon, Rachel called Ethan while he was still at the hospital. "Can you come home early today?" she asked. "Emily has something she wants to show you, and Noah says he has good news about school." Ethan glanced at the clock, hesitating. But instead of replying that he couldn't, he said, "Of course. I'll be there soon." When he arrived home, Emily ran to greet him with a drawing in her hands. It depicted their family, Ethan, Rachel, Noah, and Emily, standing in front of a large hospital wing. "I drew our family, Daddy. And that's the hospital where you help everyone." Ethan took the drawing and stared at it, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. "It's perfect, my little artist," he said, hugging her tightly. That evening, during dinner, Noah announced that he had been selected to represent his school in an academic competition. Rachel beamed with pride, and Ethan raised his glass of juice in a toast. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. A few days later, Sophie was discharged from the hospital. Richard Belmont organized a small ceremony to commemorate the groundbreaking of the new trauma unit. He invited Ethan, Rachel, and even their children. Sophie, though still recovering, attended with a radiant smile. She moved carefully but confidently, a visible symbol of resilience. Before leaving, she approached Ethan. "You changed my life," she said, handing him a small drawing she'd made. It depicted Ethan helping her to her feet, with a large heart in the background. "And you changed mine," Ethan replied, his voice full of emotion. As Sophie and Richard departed, Ethan stood for a moment, watching the construction begin. He felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not just for what had been accomplished but for the potential of what lay ahead. He turned to Rachel and his children, knowing that the legacy they were building wasn't just for the hospital's patients but also for the family that supported him every step of the way. The newly constructed pediatric trauma unit was a marvel of care and compassion. The sun streamed through large windows, filling the space with light. Vibrant murals of animals painted by local artists adorned the walls, and the sounds of children's laughter mingled with the quiet hum of medical equipment. Ethan stood near the entrance, watching families and staff explore the facility for the first time. His gaze landed on the polished plaque that read, "Sophie Belmont Pediatric Trauma Unit." It was a tribute to a girl's courage and her father's generosity. Across the room, Sophie stood beside Richard, looking healthier and more confident than ever. She wore a simple but elegant dress, holding her father's hand as they greeted visitors. When her eyes met Ethan's, she smiled and waved, then ran over to him with surprising energy. "You look different," Ethan remarked with a smile, crouching to her level. "You do too," Sophie replied playfully. "I think you smile more now." Ethan chuckled. "Maybe. You might have something to do with that." Sophie pulled a small pendant from her pocket and handed it to him. It was a star-shaped charm. "I want you to have this. To remind you that even when things seem impossible, there's always a chance to shine." Ethan took the pendant, feeling the weight of its meaning. "I'll never forget, Sophie." "Thank you." Rachel, Noah, and Emily joined Ethan as Sophie turned to Emily. "You're his daughter, right?" Emily nodded, her eyes bright. "My dad's a hero." Sophie smiled. "He really is." When it was time for speeches, Richard Belmont addressed the crowd from a small stage in the center of the room. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. "2 years ago, my daughter disappeared, and I lost hope of ever finding her. But fate had other plans. Today, she is here, alive and thriving, thanks to a man and his team. Dr. Ethan Blake, you didn't just save my daughter, you showed us the true meaning of compassion and dedication." The audience erupted in applause as Ethan stood, offering a modest wave. Richard continued, "This trauma unit is a symbol of what we can achieve together, a place where lives will be saved, and hope will be renewed." The applause swelled again, and Ethan felt Rachel squeeze his hand. It was a simple gesture but full of significance. As the event wound down, Ethan wandered the now quiet halls of the trauma unit. He stopped at a large window, watching the sunset paint the city in hues of orange and pink. Rachel joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "It feels like just yesterday you found Sophie on that street," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "That day changed everything. Not just for her, but for me too. I realized how much we can do when we don't give up, even when the odds seem impossible." Rachel smiled. "And yet, you found balance. We found balance." He pulled her into a hug, gratitude filling him, not just for what they had accomplished but for what lay ahead. Sophie's story wasn't just one of survival, it was one of rebirth, unity, and the power to turn even the darkest moments into something meaningful. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He knew challenges lay ahead, but with his family by his side and the hospital as his legacy, he felt ready for whatever came next. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.